I'm Merit Janow, Dean of the School of International and Public Affairs, and it's my enormous pleasure to welcome you to this very special gathering of the SIPA and Columbia University alumni. Thank you for joining us from New York and from the US, and indeed, I understand from all over the world. Of course, it's not quite the same as gathering in person at the International Affairs Building on campus, but please know that we're very grateful to have you with us today, and we look forward very much to the day when we can gather again in person. Let me start by just offering a few very brief remarks about SIPA and the year that we've had, and then quickly move into a discussion with this extraordinary group of expert panelists. It's been a challenging year for SIPA, for Columbia, and of course for the world. Last spring, we moved very quickly to remote instruction, and over the summer, really worked hard to train and work with our faculty to create high-flex classrooms that would allow hybrid instruction starting this fall, which we have done. Not all universities or schools have done that, but as a graduate program, we felt we could, and we had about 20% of our classes both in person and online in the fall, and about 35% in the spring, and about 35% of our students were actually in the New York area this academic year, according to some of our surveys, and the rest all over the United States and indeed the world, which we have accommodated through synchronous and asynchronous instruction, but also and importantly, creating a real virtual community. And I think every organization has tried to do that. And for us, it's been an extraordinary response, I think, by our faculty, by our staff, by our students, showing, I think, amazing resilience and grit and creativity to keep our mission going forward. So we've had, I think, very effective instruction overall. We've had, I think, extraordinary convening. And of course, when you're living in the virtual world, it's not just these intellectual forums, which are so important and are pedagogical, but also being able to do capstone projects and applied projects and have our faculty continue with their research, as well as undertake new research responding to the crisis that we're in and its numerous effects. So it's been an extraordinary year, and one where I've never been more proud of Columbia University and of our extraordinary students, faculty, and staff. Much more can be said about that, and I hope we can memorialize some of it. And I do hope that the alumni who are joining us have felt that our programming and our engagement and our research has been accessible to you during this very, very challenging year. We have our virtual graduation coming up. I invite you to join us online. You'll hear about it. It will be on April 28th. And this year, we're honored to hear from both Madeleine Albright and former Attorney General Eric Holder, offering perspectives on both domestic and international matters. We'll also be having our first virtual gala, but that virtual gala is going to be also combined with our Global Leadership Award dinner. We'll be also have some online live portions before and afterwards. We're honored to be able to recognize Vartan Gregorian of the Carnegie Corporation and also Kristalina Georgieva, Managing Director of the IMF. And this year we're recognizing some amazing artists who are performing for us, Lang Lang and Joyce DiDonato. So I promise it'll be a fun evening, albeit a different experience than convening in person. So today we have this moment where we can have, I think, what is going to be a fantastically informed and expert conversation on the first 100 days of the Biden administration. There's a huge amount of ground for us to cover. And as you know, President Biden entered office facing so many crises, from the global pandemic to the global economic slowdown, the differential effects of this across the world, strained alliances, very intense US-China frictions, a deeply divided country, um, and in January, what felt like a real assault on our democracy. And a number of policy actions have been taken since he has stepped into office, enacting multiple stimulus payments, ramping up the vaccine distribution, restarting talks with Iran, putting forward a very large infrastructure bill, rearticulation of US foreign policy and other priorities. And we have with us today several accomplished SIPA alum and faculty to help us think through and consider how the Biden administration is engaging these challenges, and perhaps some observations on how it's performing so far. I'm very grateful to Fred Kempe for joining us. He is the president and CEO of the Atlantic Council. I will be brief in my bios, as you have material, and we have extraordinary alumni and friends with us. Fred, thank you so much for being here. Erin Banco is a healthcare reporter at Politico. Erin, thank you and good morning very, very much. John Neuffer, President and CEO of the Semiconductor Industry Association. John, delighted you can join us. So I've gotten a few questions from our audience in advance of this, and so please feel free, those who are watching, to send in questions using the chat feature, and we'll get to those in about 20 minutes. But let's start off. Let me start off by asking each of our panelists some questions, drawing on their area of expertise, starting, if I may, with Fred Kempe, who, of course, covers through his leadership role both domestic and foreign policy issues, and I think has been a very deep voice on foreign policy issues. I wonder if you could share with us your impressions, Fred, of the Biden foreign policy, how it's linked to domestic policy. And indeed, we heard a lot during the campaign on foreign policy about how there would be a revitalization of US relations with our allies. Could you lead us into how you think the Biden administration is doing?
Thank you so much, Janow. I also want to thank the school. I think any of us speaking here owe a great debt. I particularly, as a kid from Salt Lake City, Utah, who I always called New York my first foreign assignment, and so I've never looked back. And my foreign life began in New York City, and then I spent 25 years abroad, and now I'm back again after working for the Wall Street Journal for most of that time. So let me touch, first of all, on what I would call the audaciousness of President Biden's first 100 days and the connection between, as you said, domestic policy and foreign policy, which is intentional on their part. And then second, very briefly, on some of the key foreign policy tenets, and within which I'll discuss, of course, China, and I'll do that all really quickly. So President Biden has one of those rare opportunities that present themselves for a US president, and that is he has a chance to be a transformative president. But even more, we now see in his first 100 days, he has a determination to be a transformative president. If you look at his $1.9 trillion COVID relief bill, that's audacious. If you look at the infrastructure plans that came out this week, they're huge. They're meant to be huge. The people who've come in from the Biden administration take away a few lessons from that administration. One of them is don't listen to cable news. The other is don't listen to economists. And the third is go big. or go home, and that in their democracy you have to get something done quickly. Uh, so don't wait for the last 18 months. Use the first 18 months, or you won't have. Because the midterms are going to be so important, particularly this time around. They want to be able to go in with the economy up. You could have U.S. Growth higher than Chinese growth this year. That sounds crazy, but it's possible. 6.5% growth. And Jamie Dimon of J.P. Morgan is saying that you could have growth running through 2023, sort of 6.5 this year, 3.5 next year, but growth. And so there's a political element to this, but there's also Biden understanding he has a historic opportunity here. Why did he have a historic opportunity? Well, partly it was what came about in the quadruple whammy of the COVID year, and that was the worst pandemic in a century, the worst economic downturn since the Great Depression, the worst racial, some could say the most encouraging racial upheavals because of how many of this has turned out, but also the worst racial upheavals in 50 years. And then on top of that, the hugely divisive election. In a larger sense, it was an inflection point, historic inflection point, where you have a new era of major power competition. You have new tests for democracy against autocracy, where democracy's been in recession since 2006. You have uncertainties about America's role in the world. You have uncertainties about the global system of practices and institutions. And then you have technological change. I know John's going to talk about this more in the semiconductor world, faster than any time in our lifetimes, affecting everything else. And then, of course, the climate and global challenges. Biden knows all of this. He's coming into this with a sense of the historic moment. As a 78-year-old man who's lost 2 other elections, has had a lot of bad luck in his life, he's leveraging the luck of this moment. We would have been coming back from COVID anyway. He's doing it faster, and I know we'll hear from Erin on that. He's doing it faster and doing it very disciplined way. We would have come back economically anyway. He's leveraging it and making the growth even faster. And he's using the 50-50 lockup in the Senate, which can be broken by Kamala Harris, to get through things that might be more difficult to get through. We're working on that. Just one quote from Tony Blinken tying these two things together. And this is from a very important speech by the Secretary of State, March 3rd. I think it's the most important speech yet on foreign policy from the administration. And he said, quote, "More than at any time in my career, maybe in my lifetime, distinctions between domestic and foreign policy have simply fallen away. Our domestic renewal and our strength in the world are completely entwined. How we work will reflect that reality." Then in that speech, he lists 8 areas that are priorities, and it sounds hardly like a foreign policy speech, though it was. And he leads number 1 with COVID, number 2 with the economy, number 3 with the erosion of democracy, how to undo it, number 4 with immigration, how to make it more humane and effective. And of course, this is where the Biden administration is facing a lot of problems at the border. And only then he gets to what I think is most important differentiator between the Trump administration and Biden administration, and that is how they are working with allies and partners. The Quad meeting, the initial visit by Defense Secretary Austin to India, Tony Blinken, Secretary of State Blinken's first trip to the Far East, seeing our allies and partners. This is, they consider this to be, after the domestic rebuilding, they consider this the second big thing they do to build the platform for the future. He then puts in climate and green energy, tech leadership, and then only the eighth is managing the biggest test of the 21st century, and that is the relationship with China, the test with China. And they see everything else that they're listing, all 7 of the other factors, as building a platform. By making America stronger, you go in with more leverage to talk to China. They will take you more seriously. By making alliances and partnerships stronger and working more closely together, you then work with China first. For example, for the first time ever, you have the EU signing on to sanctions with the US on human rights issues against China vis-a-vis the Uyghurs. They weren't far-reaching sanctions, but that happened at all is a big departure. And so you're seeing this buildup of America has to be stronger to handle China, has to be with allies and partners to handle China, and so on. It doesn't mean you don't have a whole any administration has other things going on as well. You see the effort to pick up the Iran talks. You see issues with Saudi Arabia in the Middle East. You see issues with North Korea. But if you talk to the administration, they're very disciplined in looking at it this way. Build back America economically, build back allies and partnerships and alliances, make those stronger. Take on the Indo-Pacific as the highest priority. Second priority is across the Atlantic. This is probably the most transatlantic president we've had since perhaps George H.W. Bush. Some people say since Eisenhower. But certainly he believes that you have to have the basis of your allies to do the Indo-Pacific. And we're told we're going to get more emphasis on the Americas as well. One hasn't seen that yet. Final thing I'll say on traditional foreign policy issues, things are going slow. And they're going slow because the confirmations are slow. The State Department really only has a handful of people confirmed. The positions aren't filled yet. But you see the administration with lots of experience. Jake Sullivan as National Security Advisor, Tony Blinken, Secretary of State Janet Yellen in the Treasury, and they're using all of that experience to go after the domestic issues in an audacious way, and in a way that is set up to set the table for everything they want to do on international policy afterwards. Let me leave it there.
Fantastic. That was a marvelous framing and helps us a lot in the discussion that follows. Let me invite Erin Banco to speak next, if I could, because Erin takes us right into the crisis we are facing around COVID-19 and the response. Could you share with us your perspective on how the Biden administration is doing, and whether it's doing something that's fundamentally different, or you think that it's really just building on what came before, and the timing has been fortuitous?
Sure. Thanks for having me. I'm really happy to be with you all today. So let me talk a little bit about what was going on right before Biden took office. We were, as a country, at a place where we were just beginning to see the first doses of the vaccine roll out. What President Biden did when he stepped into office was he used that existing infrastructure, which was developed under the Trump administration's Operation Warp Speed, to significantly and rapidly expand the number of locations that could administer these doses, and to ensure that the manufacturing companies and the contract manufacturers were significantly ramping up the number of doses they were actually producing. So I credit the Biden administration for coming into office and to, very swiftly increasing the number of doses that were available to Americans and increasing the number of locations that could actually dole those doses out to Americans. However, the administration did use an existing infrastructure that was built under the Trump administration. So that infrastructure was already there. So the systems and the processes that need to go in place to get these doses out to the American public, that was already set in stone. But what the Biden administration did is that they worked really closely with governors across the country to ensure that states had the funding and the infrastructure they needed, the physical infrastructure they needed in place to make sure that those doses actually got into arms. So that means the administration built up mass vaccination sites with the help of FEMA. They significantly expanded the federal retail pharmacy program. So they got CVS and Duane Reade and a bunch of other pharmacies to sign on to this program to administer primarily the J&J vaccine. And they also enlisted thousands of health providers across the country to get federal doses from the federal government to give these out to Americans. So right now what the administration is doing is they're really banking on this federal retail pharmacy program, because what they've learned over the past few months is that Americans are more likely to walk down the block to their local CVS to get the shot than they are to drive to a mass vaccination site that could be 1-2 hours away from them. So that's what we've seen in terms of the expansion of the number of places that administer the vaccine. Now, we're in a situation where over the past couple of weeks, the administration has hit a bit of a roadblock. And this gets into some technical information, but one of the major contract manufacturers that's supposed to help Johnson & Johnson produce their vaccine had a pretty big contamination issue in their Baltimore plant. So what the administration is trying to do now is ensure that that contamination does not happen again, that another contract manufacturer is brought on to help with the AstraZeneca vaccine, and to ensure that this big partnership with Merck, which is supposed to help deliver doses in the second half of the year, goes smoothly and there's no issues with inspections in that sense. And so in thinking about how we deal with other countries in the vaccine, President Biden has enlisted Dr. Anthony Fauci to sort of take the lead in ensuring that we work with COVAX and that we can do all we can to make sure that doses get to the places in the world that just don't have many at this point. That process hasn't really started yet. So what the administration has done over the past few months is to ensure that all Americans have the doses that they need at this point before they send any doses overseas. But I will say the gap between what America is doing, what the EU is doing, what Russia is doing in terms of the development of the vaccine and the number of doses that are getting into arms is huge. There is very, very minimal vaccination going on, for example, on the African continent. So the next big conversation that the Biden administration is going to have to deal with is what can we do to help the rest of the world? And those conversations are happening now. We've already seen the Biden administration start to talk to countries such as Mexico and Canada about exporting the AstraZeneca vaccine to these countries. The AstraZeneca vaccine is viewed as just an extra set of doses for the US. We don't really need them necessarily at this moment because we have the J&J vaccine ramping up and the Merck partnership coming into full force. Just one last thing on messaging, something the Biden administration has really had to deal with more so in recent weeks than at the beginning of the tenure of the administration is it's very difficult for officials to try to message to the American public that there is hope, that vaccines are coming out and vaccinations are significantly ramping up, while at the same time trying to caution the American public that there is still risk for transmission and that we are not out of the woods yet. So what we've seen over the past several weeks is cases across the country increasing and hospitalization slowly beginning to creep up again. And so this is pretty much attributed to the emergence of new variants, which spread more rapidly than the original virus that we knew. And so that has been a struggle for the administration to be able to have President Biden get up on stage and talk about all the hope that's coming down the line, that we're having more and more Americans sign up to get the shot, while at the same time pleading with Americans to continue to wear masks, to continue not to travel unless they really have to. And this has been a tension point between the White House and the health agencies, the CDC, HHS. The conversations are how do we do both at the same time? And that has been something that's been incredibly difficult for the administration. And we'll have to just see, how these cases fare over the next few weeks. Will they continue to ramp up to have a fourth surge, or will we see them start to plateau and then eventually decline? But all in all, there is light at the end of the tunnel. I think we're at 3 million Americans getting vaccinated each day, which is incredible. The question now is, when will we need a booster shot? And that's definitely coming down the line at some point.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. Let me ask you one more question before turning to John. And that is, as a journalist, Do you feel like the Biden administration is making information available to you? Do you feel is the journalistic community feeling like you're getting access to the right people? Tell us about the environment as a journalist to get information around health issues at this moment.
Sure. So the current sort of foundation upon which the administration speaks with journalists is through the press conference model. So the White House spokesperson Jen Psaki most days will get up and have a press conference with the White House reporters, and then 3 days a week we'll have scientists like Dr. Anthony Fauci, Dr. Walensky, who heads the CDC, and others working on the COVID-19 response. They'll also have press conferences where reporters can ask questions. But there's little else that's done to reach out to reporters beyond those platforms. And so anything, it's a sort of tough question because as reporters, we're used to 4 years of Trump where they were a very, I guess you can call, leaky administration, where you were constantly getting information from people who, under normal circumstances, within normal administrations, aren't supposed to necessarily be speaking with reporters. So we're definitely entering into a new era where communications are more locked down than they were under the Trump administration. But as a healthcare reporter, there's been great transparency for baseline level conversations about how the country is faring during COVID-19, but there's been little transparency around, for example, the state of vaccinations, what's going on with manufacturers, with contamination, with issues with distribution or allocations. The next big conversation I think we all need to be having is about really how risky these variants are. The baseline conversation has been, they're risky, but we have vaccinations that can prevent against their transmission. I think that conversation is about to turn. And so the question is, will we be able to hear from the scientists within the CDC and within other health agencies about just how nervous we should all be about those variants? I think something that the Biden administration really struggles with is how much information to give the public. Do we want to warn people or scare people? No, but also, journalists need access to some of this vital information to be able to do their due diligence and make sure the public has what they need. So it's great that we're having press conferences. It's great that we're able to ask questions in an open forum like that, but there's been a bit of difficulty getting access to scientists within the health agencies to talk about some of these issues like variants.
Thank you very, very much. Let me turn now to John Neuffer. And John, thank you so much for being with us. You heard, I thought, a fantastic framing by Fred Kempe about the overall approach of the Biden administration, which he's characterized as audacious, very audacious, and a real blending of domestic and foreign, and seeing domestic vitality as the building block to establish a necessary foreign policy, including vis-a-vis sources of tension between the United States and China. And of course, one crucial part of that tension is around technology. And you are in the middle of this really hard issue, which of course I gather we're facing still a shortage of semiconductors, which is crucial for so many parts of industry. And I think a policy environment that is trying to put more guardrails around areas of economic interaction with China that includes technology intensive areas such as some products and services that involve as foundational elements semiconductors. So what are you experiencing, and how is your perception of the current environment and challenges, both as an economic proposition and, if you will, as a policy environment?
Thanks, Dean Janow. Now I'm coming through loud and clear, I hope.
Yes.
Great. First of all, thanks for inviting me. This is fantastic. Like Fred, I'm from the West, Bozeman, Montana, and also Seattle. And like Fred, SIPA was transformative for me. The experience was great. I never looked back. The network is impressive, sprawling, and very helpful, the SIPA network. So very glad to continue to be a part of that really great community. So your framing is great. So the semiconductor industry, it's the chips that go into your phones and your iPads and your computers, your toasters. They're ubiquitous. They're everywhere. They become a foundational technology. There's really two reasons we've been so successful in the last 50 or 60 years. One of them is our breathtaking speed of innovation. This thing called Moore's Law, where we put twice as many transistors on a chip every 2 or 3 years, is still alive, but it's allowed us to do amazing things in miniaturizing and making our electronic devices more powerful. We now, our most advanced chips, we now can put 54 billion transistors on a chip that size. That's 54 billion on-off switches. So the reason why we've been able to innovate so fast, one of the reasons is global markets. About 80% of our consumers are overseas. So we derive tremendous revenues and scale from the global markets that allows us to pump huge dollars into R&D. We are one of the most R&D intensive industries in the world, pumping about $1 in $5 back into R&D. And the other piece of it is that we have incredibly sophisticated and complex global supply chains around the world that have allowed us to be incredibly efficient and drives our innovation. The reason I'm raising all this is because global markets have been under siege. Global trade, some of our basic principles of global trade are in question. There's a rising tide of globalization. I'll say for the last 4 years, that whole thing probably intensified. A lot of talk of decoupling economies in ways that we had never done before. So that's a real risk for our industry and many other industries that have extensive global supply chains. So I'll say in one way, with the Biden administration, we're kind of back to normal government. We're back to government that appreciates that our alliances around the world are a strength and not a threat. And that's critically important for us. The Biden administration has thrown itself headlong into rebuilding alliances and rebuilding our relations with very important international institutions. For us in particular, the World Trade Organization is critically important. And the Biden administration is, I think, going in eyes wide open. The organization is broken in some ways and needs reform. I know this is something that's near and dear to you, Dean Janow. You've spent a lot of your life focused on the WTO, but also willing to embrace and improve the WTO instead of just write it off. So in a way, we're kind of back to government we recognize and embracing alliances abroad, and that's very important and positive for us. But Fred mentioned the Biden administration has an audacious agenda, and for us, that's very important in that it fully recognizes that that we have some vulnerabilities in our supply chains around the world. For us, we don't produce enough chips in the U.S. anymore. In 1990, we produced about 37% of the world's semiconductors. We in America. Now that's down to 12% of the world's semiconductors, and only 9% of that is done by U.S. headquartered companies. There's other foreign players here that produce some chips here. So the Biden administration recognizes that and has included in his very ambitious $2 trillion plus infrastructure plan, $50 billion for incentives to level the playing field and make the U.S. a more attractive place to build these $10, $20 billion fabs that produce semiconductors. And the reason it's necessary is because every other major foreign player, they all offer massive manufacturing incentives. Our government is not into that game. So slowly, there's been more and more fab construction being built overseas. And one thing that we've seen very clearly coming out of this pandemic is we are absolutely reliant on chips, so that we can work remotely, we can play remotely, we can learn remotely. They've been critical for medical devices, and now we're in a shortage as a result. There's tightening across all the chip sectors, and the Biden administration recognizes that for the long term, we need to be building more fabs, and more of those fabs need to be built here in America. 80% of all chips are now being produced in East Asia, and we need to rectify that. More need to be built here, and there needs to be more fabs to meet the exploding demand. I frankly think, Janow, that we're not going back. What's happened in the last year has kind of put on steroids trends that were already being laid down, already in place. And I think our reliance on foundational technologies such as semiconductor chips is going to become more dramatic. So I'll stop there. I'll just say it's the final piece is I think we're returning in a way to, I said, normal government, but also it's just in the workings of government, just kind of more coherent government that's based on strategies and less Friday night rollouts of new regulatory requirements that were not great. I'll leave it with that.
Thank you very, very much. I'd like to ask one follow-up if I can. And let me also invite our audience to start sending in questions if you have some. I've gotten some in advance of our conversation, which are also very interesting. But feel free to send it in the Q&A function. But if I could ask you one question, John, I mean, when I read the Chinese materials, they say, that one of their shifts in policy is to focus on national innovation to stop reliance on foreign sources of supply. Taiwan Semiconductor is obviously a crucial for advanced chips, and they want to produce more at home. So do you think we've got it right in our strategy? You talk about 50 billion of incentives, and of course the kind of line between military and civilian technology is being rethought at the end of the last administration, continuing into this administration. I think, as you say, there's been a shift. So I guess my question to you is, what is your assessment of the efficaciousness, given the amount of capital involved to build a chip plant and how long it takes? Are we got enough gas on the pedal here, or what's your assessment?
Oh, so first of all, the 50 billion is a great start, but you make a good point. This has got to be a multi-year effort. It's going to take more resources from the government to get us where we need to be. The $50 billion just stops us from our decline and starts bringing us back up in terms of producing more chips as a share of global chip sales. But the other thing you raised is, the Chinese have been very kind of upfront in saying that they want to build an entire semiconductor supply chain end to end within China. They can go ahead and try, but we've proven that is folly. It's the global supply chains grew up because of efficiencies that were gained by doing it that way. And I think that we just have to, the Biden administration recognizes that. And I think it underscores that because we need these global supply chains to be efficient and innovative, we also need to make sure that our alliances are strong. The Japanese are very strong when it comes to making multi-million-dollar tools that make semiconductors. We're very good on design, and we also manufacture. and the Taiwanese are very good at just manufacturing. And so we need to keep all these various alliances in great shape and not be chasing our friends away, for us selfishly, so that we can keep these supply chains thriving and open and safe.
Okay, thank you very much. So let me turn to some of the questions that have come in from our audience. And I guess one set of questions also really speaks to the polarization in our country. And I'm wondering if Fred or any other member of our panel would like to speak to what you see as the ability of conditions in Washington allowing for coalitions to be formed of a bipartisan nature, whether around specific issues or in general, that would allow some domestic issues, whether it's gun control or other issues, to advance in the current environment. Fred, do you have any examples you see of bipartisanship forming?
So I thought after the January 6th events in Washington, D.C., that there would be that to a certain extent, as terrible as that event was, I thought it would be a gift to Joe Biden, that it would allow the president to reach more effectively across the aisle. As we had seen, as we had stepped up to the abyss of our democracy and saw what could happen to our democracy when we are as divided as we are. Sadly, that hasn't been the case. I think President Biden is the most likely sort of leader to be able to reach across the divide. It certainly is what he would like to do. Some people would argue it might have been easier or even forced him to do that if the Democrats had kept a minority in the Senate instead of their 50-50, and then with Kamala Harris as the tie-breaking majority. So I'm afraid that this deep division and polarization, where one of the things that worries me most, and I was not only in SIPA, I was also a graduate of the journalism school at Columbia, is that people are living in separate information environments. People in the United States are not even agreeing to the same set of facts. So this is a problem of social networks. This is a problem of cable news. This is a problem of gerrymandering. It's a problem of money in politics. But we've got a long way to go before we will adequately deal with this polarization. I think it also means that our allies, as eager as they are to embrace the Obama administration, they're happy to see us solve problems between Airbus and Boeing. They're happy to see efforts, quite genuine and already somewhat successful efforts, to reduce tensions among allies. They're still going to be wondering what's going to happen 3.5 years from now, 4 years from now. So I think there'll still be some hedging of the bets. Is the United States back as an international player that wants to work closely with friends and allies? Or is the US going to be, and coming back again to be, the consistent glue that was holding the international system together over the last 75 years? Are we going to return to that role more or less? Or are we going to be buffeted every 4 years by election outcomes where you have a quite different United States on the global stage? I don't think there's an answer to that yet. And I think the Chinese, and I want to go to something that John was talking about as well, the Chinese are going to bet on the fact that we remain polarized. What they're trying to do is say, look, we are going to unify the global system around the fact that we're all in it together. And the US is trying to divide you between democracies and non-democracies, and their democracy doesn't work very well anyway right now. They're using the first mover advantage economically coming out of COVID to say we have a more effective economic system. They're using January 6th and other things in the United States to say we also deliver for our people and we're not as divided. We can get things done more quickly. And so this is a really important time for Joe Biden. He's talked about this openly, about this, how this is a test for democracy, and we actually have to prove that our system can still work. And then just one last thing on semiconductors. It is the pointy edge of the spear in the competition between China and the United States. And you may be right, John, that the Chinese cannot do the end-to-end supply chain of semiconductors within their country, but they sure as hell are going to try. And if you look at what they've accomplished economically in artificial intelligence and infrastructure and many other fields, we better not be sanguine, because we have had the commanding heights of technological innovation and leadership for so long that we've become a little bit, unaware of how quickly that could actually change, and then how that would change the global landscape and geopolitical landscape should we lose that technological edge that we've had really since the end of World War II.
Thank you very much. I'd like to bring Erin into this conversation, and really we've been talking in the context of, forging coalitions across party lines to advance the public policy agenda, including, if I could invite you to comment on handling of the COVID pandemic, and also of the vaccine rollout, and also how we think about what the U.S. is doing in the world. You mentioned U.S. is wanting to join COVAX. I think we do have a aggressive efforts by China now to also inoculate the world with their vaccine. So there is a vaccine diplomacy dimension developing around this. Could you speak a little bit more about how intensely you think the partisanship is affecting the ability to execute on this agenda?
Sure, absolutely. That's a really good question. I can actually talk about some of the more granular conversations that are taking place between the White House and the administration and governors as it relates to the distribution of the vaccine. So Biden's plan all along was to make sure that no matter what state you're in, the vaccine is going to be distributed equitably across the country, right? There's not going to be, blue states getting more doses, red states not getting as many as the blue states. So that was the platform that he started with. But as we've seen federal sites come online, so those are the mass vaccination sites that are run by FEMA, there has been quite a bit of disagreement between the White House and governors, particularly governors in red states, about the existence of those sites in states like Florida and other states in the South run by Republican governors. The issue broadly is that these governors don't want the federal government involved in the vaccine rollout, that they feel like they have the infrastructure in place where they can handle it. There's also been a lot of nitty-gritty infighting between the administration and governors about, how many doses are allocated through the federal program in their state versus how many the state itself actually gets to administer and to roll out to their populations. The other big conversation between Republicans and the administration is that the CDC has a website where it basically shows how each state is doing with the administration of the vaccine. So, for example, let's just say hypothetically, for Florida, it will say 2 million doses have been, doled out over the last week, but only 800,000 have been administered. It really shows just how well or not states are doing with that administration process. And very early on, there were a lot of concerns that states weren't doing enough to take those supplies that they had been given by the federal government and get the shots into arms. So that is some of the nitty-gritty conversation that's going on right now. And I think more broadly, there has been quite a big deal of cooperation, I think, between blue states and red states and the administration on funding for states to fight COVID-19. I think everyone's pretty much on the same page for the fact that these states need just simply need more money, if not for the administration of the vaccine, then to help their local economies and to help, places like, local healthcare facilities manage the response. And there's been a lot of conversation about the need for funding around public health departments, which have been chronically underfunded for decades. And I think the conversation now that's happening within the CDC and within states and within the White House is, how do we get more money to the states to help them prepare for the next big outbreak? And so generally, I think, as I said, states and the administration are sort of all on the same page that more money needs to go into the ecosystem to make sure that we don't fall behind for the next big outbreak. But internally, the way that the vaccine is being distributed has been a huge tension point between the administration and Republican governors. And I think it will continue to be that way. These governors really don't want the federal government there taking over the vaccine distribution. In regard to COVAX and the way that we work with other countries on distributing the vaccine, these are conversations that are brand new. They're just starting to take place now. The real focus for the administration has been, let's get as many Americans inoculated as possible. But right now there's a huge question of who's going to take the lead on vaccine diplomacy. As you mentioned before, China has begun these conversations and they're already sending doses across the world, really. And so the US is trying to find their way into that conversation. I think the African continent is particularly of concern. There is basically no genomic sequencing being done on the African continent right now. So we really don't have a clear understanding of where these outbreaks are occurring. And so I think you'll start to see Dr. Anthony Fauci begin to appear more publicly talking about vaccine diplomacy, but we're just not there yet at this point.
Thank you very much. Well, we have only a couple minutes left, but now I'd like to just ask each of you, you're just incredibly deep and engaged policy analysts and advocates, although not Erin as a journalist, you're not. But nevertheless, if the president called you into the Oval Office and said, how am I doing and what do I need to keep my eye on in the next 100 days? I'd like, if I could, to invite each of you to give your elevator response to the President of the United States and get your suggestions. Could we start with you, John?
Continue your go big and go home efforts, or go home efforts. We got to be ambitious. We got to think big. The polarization of the country has been sickening and painful to watch, I think, for all of us. But and this is to Fred's point, I think when it comes to losing our technological edge, that is a critical issue for us. And if there's one area that I think we have hope for bipartisan support, it's in tackling that challenge. President Biden understands this, and in our sector, with this $50 billion for more domestic chip manufacturing, it's being expressed. So, like I said, audaciousness is necessary, and I hope he sticks with it.
Terrific. May I ask Fred Kempe for his assessment and recommendations?
My assessment is that the direction is right, but one has to send some very clear messages, particularly to China, but also to Russia, so that there are not miscalculations on their part. I think they will test the Biden administration. They may test the Biden administration relatively early. I think you're already seeing that with Russia, with its movement of troops around the Ukrainian border. And you're seeing that with China regarding Taiwan. I don't necessarily believe that they'll take military action that will prompt military response, but they may try to create some facts on the ground that are irreversible. And so there needs to be some very clear messaging. So even as they build up their domestic economy and go methodically into other foreign policy areas, we understand that a lot of foreign policy presidents end up making their names through unexpected events that come up, challenges that one did not anticipate. And I would say Russia around its borders, particularly Ukraine, and China around its borders, particularly with Taiwan, are probably the two to watch most closely.
Thank you very much. Those are really important areas of real risk in the system. I appreciate you drawing them out for our attention. Erin, may I invite you to leave us with your last observations and suggestions?
Sure. I think, as a healthcare reporter who covers predominantly COVID, I'm keeping my eye on the new variants and the way in which our country handles their replication and transmission. I think any healthcare reporter or healthcare official in the administration will tell you that there just needs to be more sequencing done on these variants. And I know we're working on it as a country. The question is whether or not we're scaling those efforts up quick enough. I think what we're seeing now with this possible fourth surge is a worrying sign about these variants and their transmission and the rates in which they replicate. And the hope is that we can inoculate enough Americans before it really gets out of hand. And so the administration, that's all they're thinking about in terms of healthcare right now in COVID is just getting as many Americans inoculated as possible. And now we've seen some of these pharmaceutical companies like Pfizer apply for emergency use authorizations for vaccination for children. And that will be the next big thing to watch, particularly as the summer months roll by and schools begin to open again in the fall.
Well, thank you. So sorry, please go ahead.
Janow, can I, there's just one mention in the chat, and I think we'd be remiss not to say anything about this. And it's Bruce Rubin saying the border, all caps with exclamation points. That does touch what I'm talking about, which is what pops up that becomes such a mess that it can throw the Biden administration off its course. And the interesting thing is it actually hasn't thrown the Biden administration off its course yet, but the border situation is obviously a terrible situation, morass, and how they manage this will, and particularly Vice President Kamala Harris, how she manages will be one of the first big and most important tests for the administration.
Thank you very much for that, for calling that out. I missed that. In fact, we have many excellent questions that came in around key regions of the world, whether Brazil or India or Turkey, Afghanistan, indeed handling of immigration issues, defense spending, R&D modernization, and much more that we didn't get a chance to turn to specifically. But we have extraordinary alumni, and our community is really fantastic in the US, all over the world. Thank you all for joining us. I want to particularly thank our very expert speakers and alumni, Fred Kempe, John Neuffer, Erin, Banco. Thank you so much. It's been a fantastic conversation. I want to also recognize Susan Storms, who's organized this in collaboration with the Columbia Alumni Association, our Associate Dean for Communications, Rachel Zala, who's with us. Thank you for joining us on a Saturday morning. We hope to do this again. And thank you to our speakers. It's been a great start to the first 100 days assessment.